So I just wanted to give some of my thoughts on the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson card. So overall, I thought it was still a pretty interesting fight, even though you didn't have a whole lot of action in terms of a knockout or really any knockdowns. I still thought that the fight was interesting, and especially given the conditions, I thought there was still a good amount of back and forth for what we got. And I do think this ended up being a little bit more of an exhibition rather than an all-out boxing match. And I really don't think that was that much of an issue just due to the nature of the 30 age difference between both of them. And I think this really does make sense just going back to the original conditions of the fight. You do have the fight originally being more of just an exhibition. I think there was even consideration of headgear before, and then they did move the fight to a pro bout. But you still have also the heavier gloves in terms of the actual fight rules. So I do think it makes sense also looking at the time, having 2-minute rounds instead of 3 minutes and then only going 8 rounds. I do think since not only the length of the fight was shorter, but the length of the rounds were a lot shorter, I think that obviously didn't allow a lot of those certain key moments from turning one way or another. So I think really looking at all of that, it makes sense as to why we got the outcome that we did. But in terms of the specific fight within itself, I thought there really wasn't too much to complain about from either Paul or Tyson. I thought for Tyson being 58 years old, coming out as strong as he did and going 8 rounds, I thought was really impressive. I thought especially just the maybe first or even second round, just the fact that Tyson was able to keep Paul honest at 58 years old, I thought that was really interesting. And for Jake Paul, I think it was probably a little bit more of probably a cautious approach just in those first few rounds, just when Mike Tyson would obviously be the most powerful. That was probably his approach going into it, but either way, it still looked like he didn't want to get too close to Tyson, whether or not that was him just kind of feeling him out or just something that he went in strategy-wise. And then as the fight went longer, I think it obviously went more and more in favor towards Jake. And I think especially towards the end of the fight, I wouldn't necessarily say that Jake carried him, but definitely didn't look as aggressive as he could have been in terms of possibly hurting Tyson more or even ending the fight earlier. I definitely think there was a little bit of that towards the end of the fight. And just thinking from a marketing perspective, I think that this fight was pretty interesting at the end of the day because you did have a lot of questions on both sides in terms of Mike Tyson's age and in terms of Jake Paul's experience versus someone who is really one of the most famous heavyweight boxers of all time. So I thought that there was a lot that went into it. I thought you even had a little bit of Rocky VI inspiration in terms of the nature of the fight, but in a little bit of contrast to that, you also have Jake Paul, who hasn't really had the most conventional boxing upbringing because he really kind of got into it at a later age and really kind of got into it by himself instead of really being recruited by a promoter or anything like that. So I thought you had a lot of interesting things that went into it. And I thought the event overall was pretty good as well. Just looking at the undercard fight, I thought you also had a pretty interesting fight as the co-main event between Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor. I think at the end of the day, it was a pretty close fight. I would have liked to see the fight be stopped sooner, just given the eye poke and how bad that injury looked to be. I believe the fight rules had something in the nature of the fight being official after 4 rounds. So once you got to that point and you did see the pretty severe nature of that injury on her eye, I would have liked to see the fight be stopped, not necessarily as a doctor stoppage, but if they were able to go and just look at the points at that point, I think that would have been a much better outcome because that cut could have really turned into a disaster. And I really think you have to question whether or not the fight should have kept going. But just given how close both of the first fights have been, even though Taylor has won both, you're probably going to get a trilogy there as well. And in comparison to most other boxing cards, I would say one of the differences here was, even though this was more of a prize fight than a fight for a unification belt or something like that, having a pretty good co-main event, I would say, is something that's usually not the case for boxing. And also in terms of the logistics of the fight, I thought one of the best things for this promotion was having this on Netflix. You obviously did have maybe a little bit of a buffering or a streaming issue just because this kind of event is, I'm sure, pretty new to Netflix, let alone any sort of live sporting event. So you maybe did have a few minor technicalities there, but in terms of this fight not being on more of the more traditional pay-per-view route, I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that that's a good model to maybe work on going forward, because even though you still have to pay for a streaming platform like Netflix, you're not having to do the higher pay-per-view purchase just for one event. So I think it would be a lot more easier for a wider range and a wider market to tune into these events. So I think whether it was doing more with Netflix going forward, or maybe another streaming platform like Netflix, or maybe HBO Max or Peacock, or even something like Prime Video, I definitely like that model for a combat sports event, because looking back at the history of combat sports, this would mostly be to boxing. You did have a lot of those original fights being on cable TV and major networks. So I think this would be a much more hybrid approach to that, in terms of maybe bridging the gap between the old fights really being on cable and just getting a mass amount of attention, versus now in the more pay-per-view age. I think that would be a really interesting model going forward, and I think you're going to get a lot more eyeballs doing that. And I thought that was really one of the more interesting things along with this fight. But yeah, there's really not too much to say besides that. I thought it was pretty interesting for what it was, and had a lot of different interesting marketing strategies used in this event. But feel free to let me know if you have any thoughts on the fight itself. Really appreciate you watching, and I'll see you later.